Solving for a letter with rational equations. Very important general rule to keep in mind is to just clear the denominators first. This is where this process differs from solving for a letter on equations that are not rational. Normally, in the old sort of way, before we started looking at rational equations, our first step would be to start focusing on that variable we're trying to solve for, which in this case is z. But we can see that in this case, with z being in the denominator, it's hard to just visualize how to move things away from z and to get z alone on one side of the equation if that is our mindset at this time. So what we're going to do instead is start by finding the LCD, which in this case is just the product of all three denominators, x, y, z. There are no common denominators here, so we're going to include all of them, and multiply it by both sides of the equation in order to clear the denominators. So on the left-hand side, I have xyz times 1 over x plus 1 over y. And on the right-hand side of the equation, I have 1 over z, also multiplied by the LCD, which is xyz. I do need to distribute the LCD to both terms on the left-hand side, but on the right it's fairly simple since we only have one term. We can go ahead and do this cancellation with pen and see what we have remaining. So focusing first on the left, I can see that my x would cancel with the x in my first term, and what I have remaining then is just yz from my LCD. For my second product, I can see that the factor of y would cancel, leaving me with just xz from my LCD. And over here on the right, where I cancel the z with pen, I can see that 1 times xy, or just xy from my LCD, is all that remains. Now that I have cleared the denominators, now it's time to start focusing on that variable that I'm trying to solve for. But if we do this too soon, then it just gets confusing. So we want to get everything out of the denominators first so that we have everything on the same level, sort of a level playing field here. Then we can start focusing on isolating the variable that we're asked to solve for. In this case, the variable z appears twice. Anytime the variable that we are trying to solve for appears twice, there's a kind of standard trick for getting it to appear only once. We can't really get it alone on one side of the equation until it appears only once. And that trick is to factor it out. So we're going to factor z out of this expression using the distributive law, or just thinking of this as GCF factoring. We have z as our common factor, and factoring that out leaves me y in the first term plus x in the second term, and then I have xy on the other side of the equation. Now that I have it in this form, it's fairly straightforward to finish. I can see that since z is multiplied by the factor y plus x, I can get z alone if I simply divide both sides by this factor y plus x, which will cause it to drop out of the left-hand side and give me a nice form for z. I can write this as z equals xy over, I could leave that as y plus x or write it as x plus y, just to have a little bit nicer symmetry here. In this next example, I again want to emphasize how important it is to clear those denominators before you think too hard about the problem. If I were to start by focusing on that capital R and trying to solve for it, then I can see that it gets confusing very fast trying to figure out how to move things away from this capital R that's showing up as an added term in the denominator. If instead I just say, okay, my LCD is the only denominator that I have, it's the whole factor big R plus little n little r, then I can multiply both sides of this equation by big R plus little n little r and just see what I get and start thinking about the rest of the problem after I am done with that process. So I'll multiply it by I, and over here on the left I'll have little n big E over big R plus little n little r times that same LCD, big R plus little n little r. So that on the right hand side I can see that these two factors drop out. That whole thing cancels with the whole LCD. And on the left hand side it's safest to just go ahead and distribute here. It would be possible to divide by I to move the I away, but in general it's safer to distribute first and get everything completely simplified and multiplied out, and then see what you have and go from there. Otherwise you may end up with an answer that requires some more advanced simplifying skills. So this is going to be big R big I plus little n little r big I equals, on the right hand side, little n big E. Now I'm going to start focusing on the variable that I am solving for, and that is big R. Don't be too quick to factor out big I. Sometimes we learn that lesson so well in the previous example that we see a letter showing up twice and immediately factor it out. All that would be doing is going back to the step that we were in previously. We only factor that letter out if it is the letter that we are trying to solve for. So I am not interested really in those two I's. I'm just going to pretend that they're not even there. Well, treat them the same way I would treat them if they were not the same letter. So I only have R appearing once. This means it's a very straightforward process of solving for R. I want to start with the addition and subtraction stage, moving things away. So I will subtract the whole NRI term from both sides. And these are not like terms. Little n big E and little n little r big I definitely have different variables in them. So over here on the right I can't combine those. I'll just leave that as two separate terms. NE minus NRI. We want to be careful that we're thinking about whether the letters are uppercase or lowercase each time we write this down. That can get us into trouble too. And again, focusing on that big R that I am trying to solve for. Always coming back to the variable I'm trying to solve for. The only thing going on now is it is multiplied by big I, so I can finish this process by dividing both sides by big I. That then drops out, and my final answer would have the expression that I now have over on the right. Note that there are sometimes more than one form in which an answer can turn out and still be a correct answer. If I were to have followed a slightly different process, as I mentioned earlier, if at this stage here, when I had just cleared the denominators, if I had divided by I as my next step, I might have ended up with a correct answer that's not in this exact same form, and I can see that by just breaking this apart into two separate ratios. That could be NE over I as the first term, and then the second term, the I's would drop out and I would have just NR remaining. So be aware that this is also an acceptable form. The only difference between these is whether or not they have been put over a common denominator. Just because your answer looks different from one that's published that is supposedly correct doesn't automatically mean it's incorrect. So you want to make sure you understand how to get back and forth between these two. And to see how you would get back to the one we started with, I would just put this over 1 and multiply by I over I to see where that NRI term comes from that's in the numerator. So either of these forms really was okay. We just want to understand what they have to do with each other. For this last problem, I definitely recommend pausing the video and trying it yourself. You should know everything at this stage that you need to know to get through the problem. Be particularly careful with your capital and lowercase m's and your capital and lowercase v. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in the solution, so pause now if you don't want to see it yet. This formula from physics involves masses and velocities. The small m would be the smaller mass, and the velocity, the small v, is the velocity that the smaller mass is moving. So formulas like this are all too common in physics and math, and there really is a reason for the use of uppercase and lowercase of the same letter in a formula. So even though in a situation like this it can be a little tough to keep track of, especially since in this case the letters have roughly the same shape, it's important to get your penmanship and your care in how you write each term to the point where you won't really have any doubt as to whether you are working with an uppercase or a lowercase of that same letter.